third speaker, we have Daniel Munblit from King's College, London. He's going to tell us what DENCALL is all about.
Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you, Adam and Stephen, for inviting me here. It's a wonderful opportunity to share our results of our DENCALL project. And since it is getting close to the end of the day 2, I would like to say I think that's an absolutely great, amazing meeting, very successful meeting. So congrats to you organizers. But that's just my personal view. So that's how I see it. I see it's a great event. But this is my evaluation. So maybe Adam and Stephen has something different in mind as an outcome. So something I want to talk about the outcomes and core outcomes is, but first I want to define the outcomes and their importance. It just, very often people they don't realize that outcomes are all around. Waking up in the morning, you are meeting someone and you wish them a good day, but good day for you may not be good day for them, because this is a very different, this really depends on your personal evaluation. I want to give you a few examples. Sorry for provocative examples. So I'm originally from Russia. So the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, started the war a few years ago with an intention to make Russia great again and to have a bigger territory to be added to the country. And he most definitely sees this as a benefit to the country, as a very valuable outcome, moving on to the future, to make Russia bigger and more powerful. So to me, looking few years into the war, this is the official list of countries that Russia considers friendly or neutral. So not that many considering the overall grand scheme of things in the world. So to me, Russia lost the war beginning the war, right? So it's a terrible outcome from my view, from my point of view. But for Mr. President, it may be completely different. I currently reside in London and work at King's, and we have Starmer as a Prime Minister, so I won't go in depth into British politics. There's a lot of talks about migration, because migration is the biggest problem of Britain. And Britain is heavily, fiercely fighting at the moment students, obviously the biggest problem of migration. So, and also agreeing certain deals with France on migrants. And Starmer most definitely feels that, or at least portrays this as a very beneficial outcome. But there are critics of this, and they disagree. They don't think that this outcome should be measured the way it is measured or assessed the way it is assessed. So obviously, as a humble guest to the United States, I cannot really comment on Mr. Donald Trump and his tariffs. So again, it's difficult to tell, but probably Mr. Trump feels that tariffs is something that is very beneficial to the country, although there are some other opponents to this view, probably from the Democratic Party and many others, that do not see it this way. So again, it all depends on the outcomes and how we measure them. So coming back to dengue, what our study was about, and yes, I could continue. There are a lot of interesting politicians in the world. And so coming back to our study, and again, thank you very much for inviting, and thank you for everyone, because there are several people in the audience, and as well as at the table, that kindly contributed and actively participated in our study. So our project was to develop a core outcome set to be used in all future dengue treatment trials, so specifically treatment, and we're talking about effectiveness clinical trials. So I need to say what is the core outcome set, but first, I think many people highlighted already in their presentations. We have heterogeneity across the field, irrespective of what you do, whether you're involved in basic science or you're doing epidemiological research. So we measure in clinical trials hospitalizations and some objective measurements, like function test, for example, or biological markers. You can look at need in rescue medications or patient satisfaction, which is not actually an outcome, but many people measure it, morbidity and mortality, quality of life, subdomains, or in principle, generic quality of life, or signs and symptoms that have been frequently measured with patients with long COVID, and with post-dengue, you see in presentations and publications that this is something that's commonly measured. All of these are very heterogeneous outcomes. I can measure quality of life, and you can measure viral load. Somebody else may be measuring severity or hospitalizations. And all this heterogeneity is multiplied by another heterogeneity of the instruments that we use to measure these outcomes. And just an example of quality of life, we have some generic instruments such as PROMIS, for instance, or we have some disease-specific quality of life instruments, in this case just hematological quality of life index. And one of the most iconic examples goes back in time to the assessment of instruments used in the trials of schizophrenia, so in mental health disease. And over 60 years of clinical trials, over 2,000 different scales been used to assess outcomes in these trials. So again, this level of heterogeneity do not allow us to pull the data into meta-analysis, do not allow policymakers to make decisions, because guidelines are very difficult to develop then. So a concept being proposed suggested to tackle this issue, so-called core outcome sets. So if we could agree on a core selection of outcomes, a critical minimum that should be measured in every single clinical trial, then we'll ensure that at least we have a small bunch of outcomes measured in a similar way moving forward, so they can be then compared, trial results can be compared. This does not mean that other outcomes are not important. They are important indeed, but they're not just critical because it's not feasible to measure every single outcome in every single clinical trial. So we just need to find out which outcomes are critically important. That's usually quite a challenge. So this is the team that is behind this project. Sophie, Jakub, and Laura Merson from ISARIC are co-leading projects with, and myself as well, so three of us are co-leading the project, and Anastasia been coordinating beautifully. There's a bunch of students from King's as well as from Sechenov University in Moscow, and we have a wonderful steering committee that are on the screen, so all those people being at the core of the core outcome set development. So the actual process was rather complex and stepwise. So I will take you through the process. The study has been accepted a couple of weeks ago to be published in the Lancet Infectious Diseases, so I hope that within the next month you will be able to read it in full. So the first phase it's a classic approach to core outcomes development. First, we need to decide what should be measured, and then we should move on to how each of these core outcomes should be measured, so which instruments to be used. And I'm a methodological lead of the project, and Sophie is a clinical lead of the project. I'm not an expert in dengue. My clinical background is in pediatrics and allergic diseases. So I'm a clinician, but not an expert in dengue. So experts in dengue, including our steering committee, Sophie, and other experts involved, suggested that we must develop individual core outcome sets for early stage of the disease, where the majority of patients are managed in outpatient settings, for hospitalized individual, as well as specifically for those trials that are aiming at intensive care, so critical care patients solely. So we started with hospitalized individuals, and prior to this, it's a classic, again, approach for core outcome set development. We reviewed what had been done. So which outcomes have been previously measured in clinical trials. We also, thanks to efforts of our colleagues in OCRU in Vietnam, they ran a series of semi-structured interviews with patients there to hear more about their experience. All of this data from the systematic review as well as qualitative interviews were fed into the long list of outcomes. And the long list of outcomes was really long. There were over, I think, 1,300 different outcomes. So again, just demonstrating the level of the degree of heterogeneity in the clinical trials. So then they've been classified, reviewed by the management committee and our steering committee. And then we kicked off the Delphi process. I didn't include slides on Delphi process, which is my bad, so I'll explain with hands. So because I'm not sure if all of you have been involved in the Delphi process. So Delphi process is just a series of surveys where participants are shown the outcomes with a plain language description, and they have an opportunity to vote for each outcome in terms of its importance, on how critically important is it for the outcome to be included in the core outcome set. And they score each outcome on a scale from 1 to 9, where 7 to 9 means that they feel that this outcome is critical enough to be included in the core outcome set. And then in the second round of Delphi, they see the same outcomes, the same description, but in addition, they also see the distribution of the responses of other people that participate in the Delphi from the first round. And then they can readjust their scoring. So they may say, okay, I want to keep my scorings as they are, or I wish to change them. So the Delphi process being undertaken in multiple languages, as you see, and the selection of languages reflects the endemics of dengue. And we had 2 rounds of Delphi and then a consensus meeting at the end to reach a final agreement, final consensus. With regards to Delphi process, we had slightly less than 300 participants in the first round, with a bit of decline in the second round. Again, this is something that we commonly see in the outcome harmonization processes. And we had three groups of participants, which were healthcare professionals and researchers with a personal lived experience of dengue. So they're experts, they're healthcare professionals and researchers, but they experience dengue as a patient as well. Just healthcare professionals and researchers who have never had dengue, as well as patients and carers. And as you can see, this is the Delphi demographics, which is very close to the endemic regions where dengue is prevalent. So certain parts of the world that sadly are not represented. So that's, I take it as a limitation of our study. As a result, we fed into the Delphi, we provided participants with 14 different outcomes, and they ended up voting for 7 of them as critical outcomes that must be included and assessed in every clinical trial of hospitalized individual. What we did then is that we ran another consensus meeting. Sorry, I don't know why it's switched, turned into the next one. So we ran additional consensus meeting for early stage of dengue, and additional and ask people whether they feel that additional outcomes should be added. As you can see, that's a combination of, so for hospitalized individuals, you see that this is mainly clinical outcomes, and most of them are very hard outcomes, such as mortality, organ failure, development of shock, severe bleeding, etc. So they are really clinical outcomes. For early stage, additional outcomes that have been considered and voted in included health-related quality of life and resolution of acute symptoms, as well as viral load, which I personally did my best to encourage people not to include it. But again, there's a consensus. We, in comparison to Russia, we have a democratic process that is reflected by viral load being a part of the core outcome set. So we have core outcome set for hospitalized individuals as well as early stage. And then for ICU HD, so again, I'm talking here solely about clinical trials that want to aim just at critical care patients. A good practice and the suggested recommended approach is to look for available core outcome sets. And there are plenty core outcome sets that have been developed specifically for critical care individuals. Because when we were talking with colleagues, we brought together experts in critical care that manage dengue patients, as well as critical care experts from around the world that have been developing core outcome sets for critical patients. And all of them suggested that a critical care patient is a critical care patient. It is irrespective of the disease. They don't really care whether it's dengue, whether it's acute respiratory failure or whatever. whether it's COVID, we're talking about critical care patients, and a general decision was made with involvement of critical care physicians that we will recommend trialists to select from available core outcome sets for critical care settings if they are looking just to run a clinical trial just on this specific subpopulation. So what we did next is, once we agreed upon core outcomes for hospitalized and early stage, we moved on to core outcome measurement set development to define how to measure each of this outcome. And in order to do that, we held a series, so we reviewed available literature, looking at which instruments being used, how outcomes being measured. Mainly, as you could see, they were clinical outcomes, so there were different ways of measuring this clinical outcomes. We reviewed the instruments, developed statements, had several meetings online where they've been discussed with experts. Patients have not been involved at this stage because we were discussing just clinical outcomes. And it is wonderful that Morgan been given just the talk on patient-reported outcomes, because evaluating patient-reported outcome measures for inclusion into core outcome set is a very lengthy process, and it will take us another probably 6 to 12 months to do that. So for that reason, we just focus for the well-being on clinical outcomes, on the way how to measure them. But we did some preliminary review, and there is not much, sadly, in terms of patient-reported outcome measures, and the number of instruments is very, very limited. So I think, and most definitely, it's very reassuring to see that work that's been done by Merck may feed into the core outcomes that have been developed and may close this niche for which we haven't suggested the outcome measures. So we conducted a hybrid meeting in Ho Chi Minh City earlier this year in February, with many people attending the meeting and 30 voting participants. And we presented statements at the meeting that were modified at the meeting following discussions and voted. So the threshold for the measurement to be considered to be adopted was 70%, and as you can see, we managed to reach a consensus on each of the outcomes with regards to how to measure them. The descriptions of each of the measurements was quite detailed, and if I would include it on the slide, it would take us too long to go through all of them. You can find them on the website, but we will also I'll ask kindly Adam and colleagues if they can maybe share to all participants if you're interested. We have these cards and you can have a look at them. There are a couple of examples, just you can see them on the screen. So for instance, organ failure was defined, we suggest to define it as a dysfunction of one or more vital organ systems using SOFA score at least 3 times, so the timing is also provided. So again, all of this been heavily and very extensively discussed. Some people in the audience who participate in these discussions can confirm that they were very intense, but very productive at the same time, because as you can see, we ended up with consensus. So something to specify here and to clarify, we are not, by no means we say that this is the perfect, ideal, and only gold standard way to measure these outcomes. That's number one. Secondly, this is for clinical trial, effectiveness clinical trial purposes only, not for clinical practice. And this is to harmonize. So this is to ensure that people are measuring something in clinical trials in a similar fashion. And we acknowledge that it may be, you may have patients that are outliers and they do not fit into a very specific outcome. But if we want to harmonize something across the world, this is sadly the only way to do that. So again, as you can see, we have it for all the outcomes apart from patient-reported outcomes that, as I said, will take more time for us to deliver and finalize. So the whole process, you can see, was multi-stage and detailed. I hope that the manuscript will be published very soon, and we can share information with all of you once it happens, and you can read everything. We also provide a lot of supplementary material with details on each consensus meeting, so you can see which aspects been discussed in great detail. So the key message really is that we achieved the global consensus on core outcomes and core outcome measurements set for dengue clinical trials, effectiveness clinical trials. Stakeholders from over 35 countries been involved. We have 7 outcomes for hospitalized, 11 outcomes for early stage, including patient-centered outcomes, and measurement recommendations being provided for all clinical outcomes that we hope will provide more comparability between the trials. We acknowledge that there are some limitations to the study, and maybe more will come with our assessment of prompts. And we hope that this framework now in place will be used, but obviously with the development of the field, there may be a need in future updates and regional adaptations. And one final note, when you will be reading the paper, we provide also a table which is not a result of consensus, but a suggested table that we suggested endpoints for clinical trials and their importance for specific effectiveness clinical trials. And we consulted with EMA on this matter. They kindly provided their views. So to ensure that core outcome set is measured, but reliable primary endpoints are selected in clinical trials. So we really hope that this core outcome set will contribute to the trial design. And this is our contact details. If you want to run a consensus process or you're interested in evidence synthesis, let us know. And just the final note, thanks to, there are too many people that have been involved to name them all on the slide. Thanks to funders, thanks to ISARIC, and you can also find a small advert from our side. We're looking for 2 young individuals from developing countries that will join our team on funding. We have full funding for them for 2 years. If someone is interested in helping us developing core outcome sets, please join us. And thank you very much again for inviting.
All right. Thank you, Daniel.